In 1968 alone, English courts actually signed over 16,000 adoption orders.
Hmm.
And if you zoom out, like if you look at the period between 1949 and 1976, we are talking about an estimated 185,000 babies taken from unmarried
Right.
mothers.
It was a massive scale.
Yeah, the system was just running at full industrial capacity.
Mm.
And today, decades later, the UK government and the Church of England are, well, they're finally moving closer to issuing an official national apology for that system.
Which, on the surface, that sounds like a victory.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
we're taught that an apology is a resolution,
Yeah.
right? The wrong is named, the tears are shed, the file is closed, and everyone gets to move forward. But what if that's a complete illusion?
Yeah.
What if saying sorry on a national stage isn't a bridge to healing at all, but rather the government's newest, most effective way of keeping the victims entirely boxed in?
It is, it's the ultimate paradox of institutional apologies. I mean, we view them through the lens of our personal lives.
Right, like an apology between friends.
Exactly. If a friend wrongs you and apologizes, that apology usually comes with a change in behavior, with actual accountability. You repair the relationship.
Yeah.
But when a state issues an apology for a massive systemic harm, it operates under entirely different mechanics. The words can be incredibly moving in the room, but the actual repair, like the structural change required to make things right, it never arrives. It basically functions as a containment strategy.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We're exploring a profound and frankly challenging piece of writing today titled "The Apology is the Newest Wall."
It's a really heavy text, but so necessary.
It really is. Our mission for you today is to look at what actually happens after a government says sorry for forced adoption. We want to tear down the assumption that an apology is an ending, and instead examine the strange, heavy new chapter that opens up when the state finally admits fault. Because the author of this essay, who is Australian and actually lived through their own country's national apology for forced adoption back in 2013, they argue that an apology can quietly seal away more truth than it ever brings to light.
Yeah, and to understand how an institution can say, "We are so sorry," without actually fixing the harm they caused, you have to look past the podium and the applies.
You really do.
You have to look at the machinery running beneath those words. There's a brilliant framework presented in the essay called the architecture of silence. And this architecture, it relies heavily on hard tools.
So let's break down what those hard tools actually look like for, say, an adopted person on a Tuesday morning just trying to access their own life.
Right.
Because we aren't just talking about abstract ideas here. We're talking about a physical, sealed adoption file sitting in a government basement somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about an amended birth certificate, which, that is a legally binding document that lists people as your parents who were never actually in the delivery room.
Precisely. And it also includes the bureaucratic labyrinth required to reclaim your original identity. Like, a legal route might exist on paper, but the state makes sure it's barred in practice.
Yeah, the friction is intentional.
Completely intentional. The forms, the prohibitive financial costs of going through family court, the endless administrative hoops, these are the hard tools. They are the literal physical padlocks on a person's identity.
Right. But, if you're listening to this, you might be asking yourself the obvious question. If the Prime Minister is willing to stand up and cry on television about this, why won't they just hand over the birth certificate?
Exactly.
If they're admitting it was wrong, why keep the padlocks on?
Because of liability and control. And this is where the systemic insight of the text really sharpens. The official apology, the bowed heads, the co-written paragraphs on the front page, that is not a dismantling of the architecture. No, the apology is actually the architecture's softest, most advanced tool. It produces the visible appearance of a reckoning. The public sees the government apologizing and naturally assumes the problem is solved.
Right, everyone claps and goes home.
Yeah. Meanwhile, every single hard mechanism, the sealed files, the false certificates, the exorbitant court fees, keeps running completely untouched right beneath it. An apology that isn't bolted to the unsealing of records is just silence that has finally learned how to speak.
Silence that has learned how to speak.
Yeah.
I want to pull at that thread because it gets incredibly insidious when you look at the exact words the state chooses for these performances.
Oh, absolutely.
If you listen to a government apology, there's usually one word doing an aggressive amount of heavy lifting, and that word is historical.
Yes.
They will apologize for historical forced adoption or historic wrongs.
It is a very deliberate linguistic choice. By labeling forced adoption as this, discrete post-war scandal that magically ended in 1976, the state picks the harm up, places it in a locked box, and leaves it in the past.
Yeah.
It suggests the era of harm is totally over.
I have to push back on that framing from the state, though, because it is essentially a bureaucratic sleight of hand.
Definitely.
Think of it like a massive toxic spill in a river. If a corporation dumps heavy chemicals into the water in 1970, and today they step up to a microphone and sincerely apologize for the historical spill, well, calling it historical doesn't change the physical reality that the water you're drinking today is still poisoned.
Right. The harm isn't in the past.
Exactly. It's actively living in the bodies of the people drinking the water right now. To date the harm is to exempt the present from it.
That analogy perfectly captures the danger of the word historical, and there is a darker revelation here regarding the underlying mechanics of child removal. The foundational logic of the forced adoption era, the belief that a child is better off being taken by the state than a poor, unsupported, or unmarried mother is supported, that logic didn't die in 1976.
Wait, let's pause and clarify this because it's a huge claim. When you say the logic didn't die, how does that manifest today? Because if you say modern care order, I think most people assume you mean child protection services stepping in to save a child from a severely abusive home. How does the systemic critique connect modern child protection to historic forced adoption?
It's a vital distinction. We are not talking about genuine cases of severe abuse. We are talking about the bureaucratic reflex to punish poverty, lack of housing, or lack of social support by removing the child rather than resourcing the mother.
Wow.
Yeah. The essay points out that this underlying punitive logic simply changed its paperwork. It evolved into the modern care orders being signed in family courts this very week.
That's terrifying.
It is. But if the state successfully brands the forced adoption era as historic, they completely insulate the present system. The care order signed today becomes a separate department, a different era, and absolutely nothing to apologize for.
So the state builds this wall of paperwork in past tenses, but the actual living cost is carried by the adopted people who are still navigating this maze today. Which brings us to a figure who is central to understanding this deeply personal cost. We need to talk about the late advocate, Highcroft Rabs Tovey.
Yes, Tovey was an adopted man, a tireless advocate, and the head of Adoptee Watch UK. We speak of him today with immense gravity, as he passed away earlier this year, tragically before the state could even bring itself to speak a single word of the apology aloud.
It's just devastating.
It really is. His life and his life's work are a profound testament to the reality that this system is not a relic of the past.
And, just look at the architecture of his name, Highcroft Rabs Tovey. 3 distinct names, carried by one person.
Right.
For most of us, a name is the most ordinary baseline thing we own. It's just a given. But for someone processed by this system, a name is something you have to actively assemble, defend, and carry in fragments.
Yeah, that's incredibly well said.
Like, Tovey was the birth name the official record attempted to write over and legally erase. Rabs was the purple rabbit he wrote through as a means of survival, and Highcroft. For an adopted person, the very name they use is often both the wound and the resistance existing in the exact same breath.
And Tovey's resistance went far beyond his name. For 22 years, from 2002 to 2024, he systematically ran the Forced Adoption and Care Order Survey.
22 years?
Yes. He painstakingly tracked the ongoing removal of children by the state, gathering the data to drag this issue out of the past tense and force it into the present. He proved, through relentless documentation, that the machinery was still humming.
The devastating reality is that the clock ran out for him. We really have to sit with that.
We do.
The clock on justice for survivors is not some poetic metaphor. Time is literally running out. The people this apology is supposedly for are aging, and they're dying while waiting for the state to find the right words.
Which brings up a profoundly complex emotional reality. When an apology does finally arrive, why does it feel so deeply hollow or even offensive to the survivors sitting in the gallery?
To understand that, I think you have to get out of the systemic analysis for a second and step into the actual body of an adopted person. The text uses this deeply embodied first-person register to explain the disconnect. It argues that an official apology only ever addresses what it calls the adaptive self.
Let's translate that into everyday life for a second.
Yeah, so the adaptive self is the version of you that was painstakingly assembled over decades just to be legible to society. It's the survival mask. It's the version of the adoptee sitting at a family dinner nodding and smiling when a relative says you were so lucky to be taken in, or your displacement was such a kindness.
It's the public self that learned how to be palatable. And a prime minister reading a speech in a parliament is essentially speaking directly to that mask.
Exactly. But underneath that adaptive self, underneath the mask that knows how to smile and say thank you, there is a lower signal, a steady subsonic hum that has been running in the background since before you even had language.
Wow.
It's a cellular bodily knowledge that you began somewhere else, in another body, in another room, under a completely different name that the official government record flat out denies exists. It's described as a literal physical pressure beneath the sternum. It's the quiet of a question that has never once been allowed its answer.
And this is where we see the ultimate failure of institutional empathy. A public apology, no matter how beautifully drafted or sincerely delivered, cannot touch that subsonic frequency.
It really can't.
It simply wasn't built to. You can be acknowledged in full daylight by the highest office in the land. You can watch the entire country weep and applaud your resilience. And then you walk right back out of that building and your file is still sealed.
Yeah.
Your original birth certificate is still locked in a vault. Your own first name is still legally out of your reach without a costly court battle.
The public wound gets thoroughly dressed for the cameras, but the private wound is completely abandoned. The state gets the catharsis of having said sorry, and the survivor gets the closed door.
Exactly.
So if you're a survivor standing outside that closed door, what are you supposed to do? Because I feel like the natural human instinct would be to just throw the apology right back in their faces, to say, if you aren't going to give me my records, keep your empty words.
It's a completely understandable reaction, but the text explicitly warns against it. Refusing the apology outright is a trap.
Really?
Yeah, it's referred to as the cynical turn. If survivors simply reject the apology and walk away in anger, they hand the institution an incredibly easy, convenient narrative.
Oh, I see. It lets the institution completely off the hook.
Precisely. The state gets to throw its hands up and say, well, we tried our best, we offered our deepest sympathies, but these people are simply unsatisfiable. They are too broken. The wound must be in them, not in our system. It turns the government into the victim of an ungrateful public.
So if you can't accept it as closure, and you can't cynically reject it, what's the alternative? Like, how does a person navigate this?
This is where we arrive at the post-tragic position. This is the core of the essay's strategy for survivors. The post-tragic position is a firm rejection of two extremes. First, it rejects the pre-tragic lie.
Right, which is that cultural myth we discussed earlier.
Exactly. The fairy tale that forced adoption was purely a benevolent rescue mission and no harm was done. It refuses to pretend the trauma away. But crucially, it also rejects the tragic dead end.
The tragic dead end being the total surrender, the belief that the government is simply too massive, the bureaucracy is too thick, the files will never open, and nothing will ever change, so why even try?
Right. The post-tragic position refuses both the lie and the surrender. Instead, it looks clear-eyed at the massive crushing weight of the harm, it holds it without flinching, and then it deliberately pivots. It turns away from what was lost and turns aggressively toward what can actually be built. It's a stance of fierce agency and reconstruction.
The imagery used here is unforgettable. You don't refuse the apology. You accept the apology, but you absolutely refuse the closure.
Yes.
You treat the apology not as the end of a chapter, but as a door. And it is a door that the institution desperately wants to let swing shut behind them the second the press conference is over.
Yeah.
So what do? You wedge it open with the whole weight of your body.
Because a door forcefully held open is the only version of an apology that leads to actual justice.
But I have to ask, because it sounds incredibly empowering in theory, but in practice, how does a traumatized survivor effectively wedge the door open against the entire legal weight of the UK government? Isn't that placing an impossible burden on the victims to fix the system that broke them?
It is a massive burden, which is why the post-tragic turn isn't just about an attitude, it's about extremely specific demands. Wedging the door open means shifting immediately from the performance of gratitude to the mechanics of a transaction. Once the state admits fault, you do not just stand there and cry. You name the bill. An apology is not the payment of a debt. It's the acknowledgement that a massive bill is now due.
Okay, so let's talk about that bill, because the demands here are not vague requests for better understanding. They are concrete structural changes. First and foremost, original birth records must be released to every adopted adult as an absolute right, not as a favor, not at the discretion of a social worker or a family court judge who gets to decide if you are emotionally stable enough to know your own name. An unassailable legal right.
And that leads directly to the second demand, which addresses the financial and bureaucratic barriers we mentioned earlier. There must be fully funded, low-barrier legal routes to reclaim your birth identity.
Right, which is exactly the fight Highcroft Rabs Tovey championed.
Exactly. If you want to reclaim the name you were born with, you shouldn't have to hire a lawyer, petition the state, and risk going bankrupt in family court just to undo the paperwork the state forced upon you in the first place.
The third piece of the bill deals with the actual human fallout, reunion and reckoning services. And we are talking about services that are resourced properly and permanently in the national budget.
Yes, not just a temporary grant.
Right, because it's a known political tactic to warmly announce a mental health fund at a press conference, reap the good PR, and then quietly defund the entire program 2 budget cycles later when the public stops paying attention. The bill demands permanent infrastructure.
And finally, the most radical shift in the power dynamic, co-governance. Survivors must have their hands on the archive itself.
That's huge.
It is. Historically, adopted people have only ever been consulted on the wording of their own sorrow. The state asks them how they feel, writes it down, and then closes the door. Co-governance means survivors are actually at the table, governing what happens to their own history, managing the unsealing of the records, and dictating the terms of the repair.
And it cannot be overstated that this bill is owed against a ticking clock.
Yeah.
The mothers who had their children taken in the 50s and 60s are elderly now. The adopted people are aging. The same clock that ran out for Tovey is running out for tens of thousands of others. The urgency is paramount.
So if you are listening to this and you find yourself watching a government step up to a microphone to issue a grand apology for a systemic wrong, how do you spot the difference between a real reckoning and a freshly painted wall? The text gives us incredibly practical, sharp advice. You must watch the verb tenses.
Yes, count how many times you hear the word happened, as in, we are deeply sorry for what happened. Past tense, finished, contained in history.
And then count how many times you do not hear the word happening. Count how often the ongoing present-day consequences are entirely omitted from the speech.
You also need to look at what immediately follows the final sentence of the apology. Is it followed by a date? A firm date for a parliamentary reading? A date for a new bill to drop? A date for the unsealing of the vault? Or is it just followed by applause and a moment of silence? Because an apology with a date attached to it is the beginning of structural repair.
But an apology with only applause attached to it is the newest wall. And it's the most dangerous wall the architecture of silence has ever built, because it's the first one specifically designed by the state to look exactly like an open door.
Wow. It completely reorients how you view these public spectacles. So what have we uncovered in this deep dive? We've seen that an apology for forced adoption is absolutely not settled history. It is not the end of the book. We have to start treating the adoptee experience not as a pathology or a trauma to be pitied, but as the profound, lived expertise that it truly is. Real repair isn't about feeling sorry in a parliament building. It's about tearing down the physical architecture of silence, unsealing the records, and recognizing that the harm is ongoing and urgent.
It requires moving past the comfortable performance of grief and diving into the hard, unglamorous mechanics of justice. It demands that survivors and allies alike hold the door open, honoring advocates like Highcroft Rabs Tovey by finishing the very real work they started.
Tovey did his share. The rest is ours. I can't recommend enough that you seek out and read the full essay, The Apology is the Newest Wall.
Highly recommend it.
To truly grasp the post-tragic consciousness, to understand that subsonic hum we talked about, you need to read these words and sit with them for yourself.
It will permanently change your threshold for what you consider institutional accountability.
It really will. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on this idea of systemic critique. We've spent this time talking about governments, forced adoption, and national apologies. But zoom out and think about your own world. If an apology without structural change is really just silence learning how to speak, where else in our society, in our institutions, or even in our own workplaces and lives are we accepting the performance of an apology, the tears, the applause, the promise of a clean slate, as a substitute for the hard, necessary work of actual repair?
Where are we mistaking a freshly painted wall for an open door?
Exactly. Something to think about. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.